Well, the currency that we would take forward would be sterling. We have made it clear that that would be the currency we would inherit those arrangements from the United Kingdom, and that's the basis on which we would plan independence. Clearly there's a debate to be had about the European single currency, but we've set out that we would only ever go into a single currency if the economic conditions were correct and if the people of Scotland voted for that in a referendum. And the economic conditions, in our opinion, most definitely are not correct for that at this time. So sterling would be the currency.
So the Bank of England would set an independent Scotland's interest rates.
We would have to operate in that fashion if that was the operation of the Bank of England.
So interest rates would be set by London.
But the key proposition that would be different about independence in that context is that a Scottish Government would be able to pursue its own fiscal policy, which would enable an independent Scotland to take significantly more decisions than can ever be taken today about ensuring that we have the economic conditions and interventions that are appropriate for the needs and the aspirations of the Scottish economy.
That's fiscal policy, but you wouldn't control your own interest rates and you wouldn't control your own money supply. You couldn't print your own money.
But crucially,
that right?
But what we would be able to, well, obviously,
is that right?
Well, the Bank of England would be able to take decisions in relation to
the Bank of England would take decisions about a country which it was not part.
Obviously,
and didn't care about.
But obviously, if it was operating within, if the currency was part of the jurisdiction of the Bank of England, if that was part of the agreement and approach that we took, then the Bank of England would operate in a fashion that was appropriate to those economic circumstances. But what we would also be able to do, and this is a crucial point, Andrew, there would be a separate distinction about fiscal policy that would be able to be taken forward by a Scottish Government, which would give us significantly more economic influence and economic leverage than we have at the present time.
No, I get the point about fiscal policy, but that's not what I'm asking about. The Bank of England would also control how much you could borrow, correct?
Well, the Scottish Government would determine what degree of borrowing it was able to take forward, because it would have to do so. But it would have to do so. It would have to do so within a sustainable climate and a sustainable framework
set by the Bank of England.
Well, but then that's where you have to take into account the fact that we have both. There is a debate about monetary policy and also about fiscal policy, because what fiscal policy enables you to do is to create a more prosperous set of conditions and deliver a greater degree of growth.
I perfectly understand that an independent Scotland sets its own taxes.
Hear me out in this.
No, I'd like you to answer this question. Would the Bank of England control how much you could borrow?
Well, let me complete this point. What's important about fiscal policy is that it can influence the amount of growth you can deliver in the economy, which is clearly a factor that influences the degree of borrowing that is required to be undertaken.
You'd have to apply to join the European Union.
No, we wouldn't. We're already part of the European Union.
But you're not independent. Scotland's not part of the European Union.
We are clearly part of the European Union today. We inherit the treaty obligations of the United Kingdom. That means we're part of the European Union.
Have you had guidance from Brussels that you wouldn't have to rejoin the European Union?
If you look at some of the most distinguished...
Have you had guidance from Brussels?
If you look at the most distinguished opinion on this subject offered by Emile Noël, one of the secretaries of the European Commission, if you look at the point put forward by Eamon Gallagher into the bargain, these are all the point I make about Scotland inheriting the treaty obligations of the United Kingdom and being already a member of the European Union.
The Royal Bank of Scotland, it's 83% owned by the UK taxpayer. Who would own it after independence?
That would obviously be a part of the dialogue that would have to take place between the United Kingdom government and the independent Scottish government.
Will you take it over?
Clearly, we would have an interest in the ownership of the Royal Bank of Scotland, but it would be part of a negotiation between the Scottish government and the UK government.
But is it the policy of the Scottish nationalists that the Royal Bank of Scotland should become a wholly owned Scottish bank again?
What the Royal Bank of Scotland should become, in our aspiration, is a privately owned bank, and we would want to encourage the Royal Bank of Scotland, as soon as it is efficiently possible to do so, to become a privately owned bank, because that's exactly what it should be.
I understand that, Minister, but for the foreseeable future that doesn't look like happening. It is owned by the British state at the moment. Will the Scottish state take it over or not?
The UK government has disposed of its interests in Northern Rock, which was an acquired institution, and clearly the UK government...
What's the answer to my question? Will the Scottish state take over the Royal Bank of Scotland?
Well, my answer to you is twofold. One is the fact that the Scottish government would negotiate that that with the United Kingdom Government, what ongoing arrangements were. And secondly, we would have the aspiration, just like the UK Government has, to return the Royal Bank of Scotland to its proper place within the private sector, which I think will happen sooner rather than later.
And in the interim, will you take over the share of its 187 billion of toxic assets as well?
Well, that's all part of the interest that the UK Government has within the Royal Bank of Scotland. It has to be properly negotiated between the two governments, but what's important is that the Royal Bank of Scotland is on a journey to get back into private ownership, and that's a journey that we'd want to support and encourage.